Aaron Mate has been spreading some disinformation about the chemical attacks in Syria, and because of that, I felt I had to debunk him, and you can conclude for yourself, is Aaron Mate a liar or a dummy? Now, I'm going to start out by showing a clip from All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a movie about World War I, and you can see for yourself what you're supposed to do in case of a chemical attack.
Gas, gas! Gas, gas!
Gas, the most feared, the most obscene weapon of all. We remember the awful sights in the hospital, the gas patients who, suffocating, cough up their burnt lungs in clots. Better to take your chances in the open rather than stay in the hollows and low places where the vapors settle.
Okay, so as you can see, the standard procedure going back as far as World War I is when there's a gas attack, you move to higher ground, you don't stay in the trenches. But I also did some research, so that, we could know what are the properties of chlorine, mustard gas, VX, and let's take a look. So chlorine gas is heavier than air, so it'll settle in low-lying areas, and this is from the CDC. So, if you want to find it, you can Google, is chlorine gas heavier than air, or you can Google, chlorine gas CDC. Also, another thing they mention is fluid in the lungs, pulmonary edema. So chlorine gas can cause that, just make a mental note of that. And then with sarin is heavier than air. Mustard gas is heavier than air. VX gas is heavier than air. So yeah, it's very, very reasonable that if you suspect there's a gas attack, you're gonna go to higher ground. And also remember that chlorine gas can cause pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs. Just make a mental note of that, because I'm going to show you something.
I mean, it's pretty clear what's happening. I don't know how much more time you have, but I have one last thing regarding the Young Turks conversation, the interview that I want to take a swing at. I don't even know where to begin with this, but the journalist made the case that in Syria, it's typical for people in Syrian culture to run to the top of a building through the staircase when they think there might be a chemical attack taking place or something like that. Like I don't even know where to start with this. There was clear exits from the building that they could have gotten to. This so-called journalist, Brooklyn-based journalist on the Young Turks, claimed that it's more appropriate in Syria and it's more normal in Syria for people to rush to the top of a building when they think a chemical attack is taking place, then leave the building. Yeah. And he claimed that, it totally makes sense that people would rush to the top of the building and not leave, and this is because they think there might be an explosion and the building might topple, which that doesn't make sense either, because if a building's gonna topple and it's gonna fall to the ground, you wouldn't want to be at the top of the building either. So help me just understand what's going through this guy's mind when he's trying to make these claims. And then you have Anna and Cenk there just being like, no, this all makes perfect sense. It was absolutely mind-boggling watching them just process this and not even question it.
It's nuts. And it starts with basically the fact that if you're a propagandist trying to justify a cover-up and ignore the real cause for how those people were killed in Douma, one of your first problems in the case of Douma is that there was a toxicology consultation where the OPCW team, the original team, before they got, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this yet. The original team that went to Douma and wrote up their report and then protested when their report was censored, they were all removed from the case. They were all sidelined and replaced by a group that, with very few exceptions, didn't even set foot in Syria.
Yeah.
Okay? So, but before they were replaced, they flew out to meet with a group of eminent toxicologists from a NATO member state, okay? Not a Russian group or a Chinese group or a Syrian group, a NATO member state. And those toxicologists looked at the video footage from the scene. And very quickly, they said there's no way that this was a chlorine gas attack for many reasons, including that there was foam seen in the people who were filmed, right? And they were saying that it's just impossible that this could have been, the foam could have developed from chlorine, because in the time that it would take for this foam to develop, everyone would have the time to flee the building to fresh air, which they all had access to. You know, there was an entrance to the basement and an entrance to the building. So in the period of time that it would take, because foam doesn't develop immediately, it's called pulmonary edema. You know, it results from fluid building up in the lungs. So in the time it would take for that to happen, they would have time to leave the building. And meanwhile, also, it also can't be that they were killed on the spot and piled up in bodies all together all of a sudden, because if they were killed instantaneously for that to happen, but bodies all on top of each other, for that to happen, it's impossible for this foam to develop. It would just be impossible, because that would have been instantaneously, and then foam doesn't develop instantaneously. It again builds up because of fluid building up in the lungs, which are active, not dead. Mm-hmm. So that's why these toxicologists ruled out immediately this was chlorine gas, and they could find no other candidate for what toxic chemical it was. That's why in the meeting was very short, because they were like, there's no way. So this guy, first of all, starts from the premise that he somehow knows something more than the world's top toxicologist and has the right to open his mouth about it and explain to a progressive audience why they made wrong assumptions. That's literally what he did. What he's actually doing is he's trying to justify some kind of propaganda that could somehow explain why these people, against all logic, as laid out by the world's top toxicologists, stayed in the building and basically voluntarily let themselves die. That's the only situation in which this foam and the bodies piling up could have developed. So that's the propaganda he's coming up with to justify it. This thing that they would have somehow ran upstairs and stayed there for a prolonged period of time to their deaths. Because, by the way, the amount of chlorine that actually entered the building it's not established, but given the size of the cylinder, it wasn't nearly as big as in previous chlorine attacks that are on record that have killed people. So this guy is basically coming up with propaganda that can justify placing the dead bodies in there. And it's ludicrous. And what it is ultimately is covering up for how they actually were killed. Because again, if it wasn't chlorine gas, as the world's top toxicologists concluded, it was something else. And if the hospital scene was staged, then it's quite likely, all the more likely, that these bodies were staged too. And so this sick guy is trying to come up with some dumb cultural narrative about how Syrians are trained to run upstairs to justify a scenario that could explain their murders. It's sadistic, and the fact that the Young Turks put him on, it's dark. This guy's justifying a war crime. He's covering up for a war crime. That's what he's doing.
Yeah. I mean, that.
Okay, it's pretty logical to conclude that Aaron Mate is either lying or he doesn't know what he's talking about, but he's very, very confident. Now, here's the thing. You know, chlorine gas does cause, it can cause pulmonary edema. You can look it up on the CDC. Also, chlorine gas sinks, VX gas sinks, mustard gas sinks, sarin gas sinks. So, it is very logical to go in the opposite direction, which is up. And I'm going to finish off by showing you a video of someone who actually knows what he's talking about.
What has become apparent is that there's very little photographic evidence of people that have actually died of chlorine poisoning, because it's not the kind of thing that your doctor can't just gas someone with chlorine and then take photos of each stage in the poisoning process. It's something that we generally don't have a big visual record of, right? Mm-hmm. We have accounts of it from World War I, which actually do feature people recounting there being white foaming. And then interestingly enough, there was a chemical accident in China in 2005 when an identical chemical, molecular chlorine, was released in an industrial accident, and it killed a large number of people. And indeed, a photo from that incident shows that a young woman was killed and that there was white foam coming from her mouth. And it looks identical to the victims in Douma.